Embarrassed first time I met Marco Rossi. I was fighting the biggest wildfire in New Mexico's history, and he was inside a burning 300-year-old Spanish colonial mission refusing to come out. My name is Diego Martinez. I'm 24 years old, third-generation Mexican-American, and I've been with the Albuquerque Wildland Fire Service for 4 years. I grew up in the South Valley, watched my grandfather fight fires before me, and I know exactly what controlled burns look like and what panic looks like. This fire, the Sangre de Cristo wildfire, officially named by the National Interagency Fire Center, was nothing I'd ever seen before. Category 5, 50,000 acres in 72 hours. Winds at 47 miles per hour. Temperatures holding at 104 degrees. And the fire was moving toward the city like something alive and hungry. The evacuation order came down at 06:00 by 08:00. I was in my wildland truck heading north toward the historic district, where centuries of architecture and centuries of history were about to get erased. The mission was built in 1710, San Felipe Neri, 300 years of adobe walls, wooden beams that had survived longer than most countries, hand-painted saints that a teenager named Miguel had created in 1743 and never left Albuquerque long enough to be famous. The church held only recorded paintings from the Spanish colonial period in New Mexico, irreplaceable, invaluable, impossible to replace, and it was directly in the fire's path. I knew this because my abuela had married my grandfather there. My parents got married there. I went to every holiday mass there. I knew every corner of that building the way other people know their childhood bedrooms. The evacuation notice said leave everything. The fire service said leave everything. The incident commander said leave everything. But some things can't be left behind. That's what I was thinking when I turned onto the access road and saw the smoke not coming from the mission yet, but close enough that the sky was turning the color of a bruise. Close enough that I could smell it. Close enough that I knew we had maybe 2 hours before the structure was surrounded. My crew was behind me, 6 trucks total, starting the mandatory evacuation perimeter. I was supposed to knock on doors, make sure residents understood the urgency, and get them moving north. Simple, clear, by the dash book. Then I heard the voice. Someone was yelling from inside the mission. Not in Spanish, not in English, just yelling, frustrated and determined and absolutely not leaving. I got out of the truck. The smoke was thicker now, visibility dropping fast. The fire wasn't visible from the mission yet, but you could feel it, that radiating heat, that pressure in the air that meant danger was coming. I walked toward the main entrance, pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Hello, fire service. Everyone needs to evacuate now. The church was dim. Sunlight coming through the high windows was turning amber orange from the smoke. The smell of burning juniper was thick, acrid. And there, halfway up the nave, was a man I'd never seen before, carefully taking paintings off the wall. He was maybe 26, lean and intense, with dark curly hair and the kind of focused expression that meant nothing in the world could distract him from what he was doing. He wore a neat white shirt despite the heat, dark jeans, and had paint dust on his fingers like he'd been handling art his whole life. You have to leave, I called out, moving toward him. The fire's coming. Just 20 minutes, he said, not even looking at me. His accent was thick Italian, I realized later. But in that moment, all I heard was stubborn. I need to secure the most important pieces. The Miguel paintings from 1743, the crucifixion altarpiece. There is no 20 minutes. I grabbed a painting he'd already wrapped, a wooden icon of a saint I recognized from childhood, and started carrying it toward the door. Come on. Wait, no. That one is more resilient. He moved to stop me, then seemed to realize I was actually helping. The paintings in the back chapel. They're the most valuable. If we can just know we're leaving. I'm helping evacuate the ward, and then we're both leaving. He turned to face me fully, and I realized 2 things simultaneously. His eyes were the most intense brown I'd ever seen, and he was completely certain he wasn't going anywhere. I'm Marco Rossi, he said, with the kind of formal introduction that made it clear he expected I should care. I am here from the Institute for Restoration and Conservation in Rome. I was given access to this mission specifically to catalog and preserve these works. They are my responsibility. Your responsibility is to not die in a wildfire, Mr. Rossi. That's a secondary concern. He turned back to the paintings, started carefully pulling another from the wall. His hands were precise, professional, the hands of someone who'd been trained to handle irreplaceable things. These pieces survived 300 years. They survived wars, poverty, neglect. They will not be lost on my watch. I should have left him there. Should have called it in, let the incident commander know we had a civilian refusing evacuation, and focused on my actual job. That's what training said. That's what protocol demanded. Instead, I started helping him. We worked for the next 17 minutes, me carrying wrapped paintings to a stone storage area in the mission's basement. Marco directing, his Italian accent getting thicker as his stress level climbed. The smoke was getting darker. The heat was becoming something you could feel pushing against the walls. And Marco kept muttering in Italian. I'd later learn it was mostly cursing and prayers. Sometimes both at the same time. The altarpiece, he said suddenly, pointing to a massive wooden structure I'd walked past 1,000 times. That one cannot be moved quickly. It requires time. We have 5 minutes. Then we take photographs. Documentation. He was already pulling out his phone, hands shaking slightly, the first sign I'd seen that he understood the danger. If we cannot save it, we at least preserve the record. For restoration, for Marco. I put my hand on his shoulder. We're leaving, now. He looked at me like I was asking him to choose between me and his child. The conflict on his face was so genuine, so complete, that for a second I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about art for him. This was about responsibility. This was about commitment to something bigger than yourself, bigger than fear. I got it. I lived it every time I went out to fight fire. The photographs, I said. 15 seconds. Then we go. He shot 12 images, his hands steady now, and we ran. The truck was parked 50 yards away. The smoke was thick enough now that visibility was down to maybe 100 feet. The fire still wasn't visible, but you could hear it, that roaring, hungry sound that means nature has decided this is its ground now. We jumped in the cab and I gunned it north, toward safety, toward the evacuation point. Marco looked out the back window, watching the mission recede. His expression was devastated, grateful, conflicted, and relieved all at once. Thank you, he said quietly, for helping me, and for, he paused, for making me leave. Don't thank me yet. We're not out of the fire zone, but we were. 3 miles north. The smoke started to thin. 4 miles, and the sky returned to normal blue. 5 miles, and we pulled into the evacuation point, a parking lot where hundreds of people were standing with their cars packed. Their lives on wheels, waiting to see if their homes would still exist in the morning. I helped Marco out of the truck. And that's when I realized he was shaking. Come on, I said, guiding him toward one of the Red Cross tents. Sit down. Drink water. You're in shock. I left the altarpiece, he said, his voice hollow. 300 years, and I left it. You saved the paintings. You saved the records. You saved yourself. I made him sit. Brought him water. That's not leaving it. That's doing what you could do. He drank the water like he'd never tasted anything. His hands slowly stopped shaking. And then he looked at me, really looked at me, and something shifted in his expression. What is your name? He asked. Diego. Diego Martinez. Albuquerque Wildfire Service. Diego. He said it like he was committing it to memory, the way he'd probably memorized every detail of those paintings. You are very brave. I'm very trained. Bravery would be staying inside. No. He shook his head. Bravery is going back into a burning building to save someone else's life work when you could have left. Bravery is knowing the danger and choosing anyway. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. Instead, I checked my radio. 12,000 acres now. Still moving north. The mission was almost certainly burning. Come on, I said. I'll take you to the shelter. You can call Rome. Let them know you're safe. Not yet. Marco stood up, steadier now. I need to see. If it burns, I need to witness it. That is the least I can do for what I abandoned. That's not smart. I don't care. He met my eyes, and there was that same intensity I'd seen in the mission. I came to Albuquerque to preserve history. If it burns, I preserve the memory. I witness. I testify that it existed. You understand this, yes? Because you went into that building with me. I understood it better than I wanted to. We drove back toward the fire line, not too close, but close enough to see. The smoke was a wall now, turning the whole northern sky the color of rust and copper. The fire had crested the ridge where the mission sat. And even from miles away, even in daylight, you could see the glow. Marco stood in front of the truck, watching it burn. His hands were clenched. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were wet. Marco stood in front of the truck, watching it burn. His hands were clenched. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were wet. I failed, he said quietly. You saved what you could. I should have been faster. I should have. Marco. I stepped beside him. You can't save everything. Sometimes you save what you can and you live with the rest. That's the job. That's the compromise between love and reality. He was silent for a long moment. Then, are you always this wise, or only when you're rescuing stubborn Italian architects from burning buildings? Only in specific circumstances. I turned to look at him. Soot on his white shirt, ash in his dark hair, eyes red from smoke, but still somehow composed. You're lucky. Most people would have died in there. Most people would have left immediately. He turned to face me. I am either very foolish or very dedicated. Can't it be both? He smiled, then smiled, sad, but real. Yes, it can be both. The fire burned for 9 days. The mission survived partially. The east wing was destroyed. The wooden beams in the nave were charred beyond repair. The altarpiece Marco had left behind was damaged but salvageable. Most of the paintings he'd rescued made it through intact. And Marco Rossi stayed in Albuquerque. He should have gone back to Rome. His institute had other projects, other buildings in other countries. But he stayed, and he helped me coordinate with the State Historic Preservation Office to document what remained, to stabilize what could be stabilized, to begin the long process of restoration. We worked together for 3 weeks before either of us acknowledged what was happening. It started with coffee. I'd pick him up at the hotel where he was staying. We'd grab coffee at a place in Old Town, and then we'd head to the mission to assess damage. He'd point out details I'd never noticed: the way light hit the adobe walls, the subtle degradation in mortar, the hidden signatures the original builders had carved into the beams. I'd tell him stories about my family, about my grandfather, about why this building mattered beyond its historical significance. Our grandfather, Marco said one morning, stirring sugar into an espresso that he'd taught the barista how to make properly. He was your hero, is my hero. He's still alive, 82, and still volunteers with the fire service. You chose to follow him. I chose to do good work. Following him was just natural. Marco smiled. In Italy, we would say you have passion. This word does not translate perfectly to English. It means you do your work because it matters, because it is part of your identity, not just your job. That's not just Italian. That's why I paused. That's you. With the paintings, yes. He took a long drink of his espresso. This is why I understood why you went back into that building. You were not being trained. You were being true to who you are. By week 2, we were finding excuses to extend the workdays. By week 3, we were finding reasons to see each other outside of work. There's a restaurant in Albuquerque called Scalo Northern Grill, upscale. Romantic, the kind of place you go when you want someone to understand that you're serious about them. I took Marco there on a Thursday night, and halfway through the appetizers, I realized I was terrified. Why are you nervous? Marco asked, with the perceptiveness that made him brilliant at restoration work. You went into a burning building for me. That was easy. This is why I stopped. Why are you still here? You could have gone back to Rome 2 weeks ago, because you asked me to help with the restoration project. That's not why. He set down his fork. He looked at me across the table, and his expression was so clear, so honest, that I could read every thought happening behind his eyes. No, he said, that is not why. I am still here because when I look at you, I see someone who will run into fire for things he loves. And I want to be someone you love like that. So I am staying to find out if that is possible. I didn't say anything. I just reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand that had carefully handled paintings from the 1700s, that had touched my shoulder in the smoke, that was now trembling slightly under mine. It's possible, I said. For months later, the mission's restoration work was officially underway. The altarpiece that Marco had abandoned was being carefully restored by a team he'd assembled from Rome. The paintings he'd saved were being cleaned and catalogued. The building itself was being rebuilt, piece by piece, following the original specifications from 300 years ago. Marco had extended his visa. He'd rented a small apartment in Old Town, one that looked out on the mountains. He'd been offered a permanent position with the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division, working with the university. And he'd somehow become part of my family. My abuela made him enchiladas. My grandfather showed him old photographs. My mother asked when he was going to make an honest man of me. We were standing on the grounds of the mission one afternoon in spring, watching workers repair the east wall. The scars of the fire were still visible, blackened adobe, new it among old, the visible seams where destruction and restoration met. "Do you regret it?" I asked him. "Staying. You could have gone back to Rome, gone back to your real life. This is my real life now." He took my hand. The mission taught me that when you love something, a building, a person, a place, you don't calculate whether it makes sense. You just stay. You just work. You just show up. That's a very romantic way to say you're too stubborn to leave. I learned from the best. He smiled. A very brave firefighter who runs into burning buildings, for paintings, for people he loves. Marco squeezed my hand. "That is what I learned from you, Diego. That love is a kind of fire. It burns, it destroys, it changes everything. And you run toward it anyway, because that is who you are." The sun was setting over the Sangre de Cristo mountains, turning the sky the same color it had been the day of the fire. But this time, instead of ash and smoke, it was just light, beautiful and changing. The light that had been hitting these adobe walls for 300 years. That had illuminated the paintings Marco had saved, that now illuminated his face as he looked at me. I kissed him there, in front of the mission, in front of the workers and the mountains and 3 centuries of history. And it felt like coming home. Epilogue. 1 year later, the mission reopened on a Saturday in spring. Hundreds of people came, locals who'd grown up with it, historians from around the country, the governor, representatives from Rome. Marco stood in the restored nave, watching people walk through the space, seeing the paintings he'd saved displayed properly for the first time since the fire. My grandfather was there, wearing his dress uniform even though he was retired. He shook Marco's hand and told him, in Spanish, that any man brave enough to risk a building for art was brave enough to be family. My abuela hugged him and slipped him a container of enchiladas for later, and I stood at the back of the church, watching the man I loved show people the work he'd done, not the restoration, not the cataloging, but the act of witnessing, of refusing to let something important disappear. That was his real gift. When the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, we drove out to the ridge where the fire had been, where you could see the whole city spread out below us. The mission was visible from up there, the rebuilt section gleaming pale adobe in the late afternoon light. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" Marco asked. "If you had not come back? Every time I drive past that building, I would have burned with it." He said it matter-of-factly, like a restoration specialist analyzing a painting's deterioration. "I would have tried to carry out the altarpiece. I would have gotten trapped, and I would have died believing I had done the right thing. Instead, you lived. Instead, I lived. And I met you. And I learned that some things, the really important things, cannot be preserved by holding on. They can only be saved by letting go sometimes, and trusting the right person to catch them." He kissed me as the sun turned the mountains red, the same red as the fire had been, but this time it was just the end of day. This time it was beautiful. This time it was home. We stayed out there until the light faded, watching the city lights come on one by one below us. The mission was one of them, restored, preserved, alive. And so were we.